Next have Dr. Ruth Morgan, who's from the UCL, she's director of the Forensic Science Centre within the Jill Dando Institute at University College London, and is a reader in crime and forensic science. So she's been there pretty much from the start, getting this new Centre of Forensic Science. So the Jill Dando Institute is the Institute of Crime Science, and they've added on the forensic science part in recent years and set up a master's program and other activities led by Ruth. So that's been very successful. Congratulations. The crimes science and forensic science, I don't fully understand the distinction, but crime science is about stopping crime happening, and forensic science is about what happens afterwards, I believe. But she can tell you.
There's a bit of feedback too.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, David. Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you to the organisers as well. It's a real exciting opportunity to be here today. The thing I'm most excited about is having so much knowledge in this room from so many different fields, and it's one of the things that keeps me excited about forensic science as I continue in it. Working together in an interdisciplinary fashion, in a true interdisciplinary fashion, has huge amounts of potential. So, as David said, we work in an interdisciplinary way within the Centre for Forensic Sciences, and some of the most rewarding pieces of work that I've been involved in have involved interactions with psychologists, with statisticians, and with lawyers. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is thinking that has come about, particularly in collaboration with Nadine Smith, who is just at the back there, who's one of our PhD students. And I'm hoping that I know I'm not going to give you any answers. I'm going to raise a lot of questions, but hopefully the way that we think about trace evidence in particular, the way that we frame it, the way that we think about it, will enable us to really apply inferential frameworks that there is so much expertise in this room within to trace evidence, and really harness the potential that trace evidence has for forensic reconstructions. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is so distinctive about trace evidence. I'm going to present a conceptual model that I've built as a result of some of this interaction, which I hope will give us a starting point for furthering the discussions that have already begun. I know there's an awful lot of conversation going on already about this, but hopefully this will be a way of potentially thinking about how trace evidence currently is, and then where we can plug in with our inferential approaches. And then I'll talk a little bit to give you some sort of more tangible examples in terms of how some of these ideas manifest themselves in a particular forensic field. I started in forensic geoscience, so the use of environmental evidence, so I will be using that as a particular example. Okay. So I think there are a number of things about trace evidence, and there are two major aspects. The first is that trace evidence is incredibly complex, and it's very, very complex in and of itself, but also within the context that it finds itself within the entire forensic process, which we're trying to utilise to enable accurate, robust, transparent forensic reconstructions. Why is it quite so complex? A number of different reasons. So, if we're going to identify the right questions to be asking, we need to think about what is it that makes trace evidence so complex. Different traces are different to one another. So directly individualizing forms of trace, such as DNA, will have a different set of parameters and qualities in comparison to the non-directly individualizing forms of evidence, such as glass, paint, fibers, soils, sediments. And there's been quite a bit of work done on this and talking about the distinctions that can be made between different types of evidence. What can different forms of evidence say? We then got the idea that we've got the capability of a particular form of trace evidence will change depending on the context. So in a particular crime, glass evidence might be absolutely crucial. It might be the critical diagnostic piece of trace evidence that cracks the case. In another scenario, similar crime type, there might well be glass evidence, But because of the context, it's not going to be the definitive piece of evidence. It's going to be descriptive, it's not going to be diagnostic. We've then got the issue of the contribution that different forms of trace can make. And this is really an idea that bringing lots of different lines of evidence together is going to be greater than the sum of its parts. So how do we identify the contribution of one particular form of evidence within a whole where you've got lots of lines of evidence? How do they interact with each other? How are they dependent upon one another? What does the increase of significance of one part of the evidence have? How does that influence the significance or weight of another part of the evidence within a particular reconstruction? And then the other aspect that we've got is source and activity. So I think there's been a lot of concentration on identifying the source of a particular trace. Where has it come from? What's its provenance? But if we're really going to answer the questions about how do we interpret this evidence, how do we know what it means, how do we know what the weight of it is in this particular case, we need to know about how it interacts in the environment. We need to know how it might have got to a particular scenario. So a lot of things Christy was saying earlier on this morning. Okay. So that's trace evidence itself. I said there were two things. The second thing is that trace evidence is complex because you've got human decision making going on at every single part of the forensic process. If you think of the forensic process, crime scene all the way through to either investigators or the court system, and you've got human decision happening, human decisions are being made at every part of that process. And it's not a simple process, as we all know, and you've got this interaction of the experience of the human decision maker. You've got their expertise and how that interacts with their experience, and then hopefully you've also got some form of evidence base that is underpinning a lot of the inferences that are being made. So you've got this interesting interaction between all those three aspects, which are influencing each of the different parts of the forensic process. So why is it quite so important that we understand this? Why have I gone on about this for almost 5 minutes? Well, what I'm hoping to present here is a way of thinking about how trace evidence perhaps all fits together, in the hope that if we can conceptualize it in this way, it will provide us loads and loads of different ins in terms of where inferential statistics and where Bayesian approaches, where Bayes nets can work to help us harness the power that is within trace evidence. Okay, so forensic process, we start off at the crime scene. We all know that it's very, very important that the right decisions are made at the crime scene, the right evidence is collected, it's collected in the right way, it's preserved in the right way, the continuity of that evidence is undertaken in a robust method. We also know that within the laboratory we've got the analysis phase. What techniques are used to analyse that evidence, what questions are being asked of that evidence which will influence what analysis is done, what is the understanding of the context or not, depending on where we're at with that, as to what that analysis is, what it means. We've got the interpretation of those results. How do we infer the weight and significance of that evidence, and how do we do that in a manner that is appropriate for the investigator as intelligence in an ongoing investigation, but also for the court system as evidence. So each part of that process is reliant on the one before happening effectively, and so we've got to think about trace evidence at each part of that process. We can't see it in isolation, it's a holistic process. We've then got this idea that we need an evidence base that can underpin the decision making that's going on at each of those phases. Now that's going to be important for a number of different reasons, and obviously there's complexity there, which I'll go into in a moment. The real trick of it then is having developed really robust approaches for analysing and interpreting trace evidence in its individual form. How do we bring it all together? How do we build frameworks that can harness the dependence and interdependence of those different forms of trace and actually assess what's going on in terms of the weight and significance? So I hope this is a helpful way of thinking about trace evidence, at least for this morning. I'm hoping by the end of the week it's going to be completely changed as people give their input and identify areas that it needs to be refined. The other aspect to it, of course, is that the human decision makers at each part of that process are involved, and obviously that's going to add an extra layer of interesting complexity. And if we can bring all that together, we are, I think, in the process of approaching a holistic approach to dealing with forensic trace evidence, which means that we're going to be asking the right questions of the evidence at different points within that system. So, just to expand a little bit.
Got to interest your model's moved on a bit. It's not the right model because there's a feedback loop between the interpretation in the first instance and the crime scene. You're kind of examining that linear process of how crime scenes operate as you keep them closed until you get the first results back, because you may have no story to go on. So it's important to understand that this is an iterative and not a linear process, just for clarification.
Sure. So I mean, in my mind, that's your interpretation aspect. You're right. You probably need an extra layer of a feedback loop in there to incorporate that iterative process. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. So, if we think about the forensic science process, we've got each phase being reliant on the one before. Each phase is going to incorporate the questions that were asked in the previous phase. And obviously that's got huge amounts of potential for going brilliantly or for not going so brilliantly. We need to make sure that we've got the pertinent questions at each part of that process. We need to ensure that the feedback loops are in place. We need tailored analysis that is context sensitive so that we can make sure that this operates effectively. The critical thing is that wherever we're at in that system, we do need to know that we're part of an entire system. So it's no use simply focusing, and it's not wrong to focus on brilliant analysis, but it's doing brilliant analysis in the context of how that evidence fits together with the whole process. We've also got a number of different types of knowledge that are embedded in that process. So we've talked about the type of evidence, the type of trace evidence, what its capabilities are, directly individualizing, non-directly individualizing. We've got the interaction of traces within a particular context. We've got questions of source, where has a particular trace come from. We've also got questions about the activity, the journey history, the transfer, persistence and preservation mechanisms that are going on. So just because that footprint mark is at a crime scene, that doesn't necessarily mean that because we can attribute the source to a particular individual that it has anything to do with the activity of the crime itself. We've got the interaction and potentially difficult, but I think something we really need to address, tension between empirical evidence bases and expertise. We need the two together. We can't have one without the other, but we need to work a way of ensuring that we've got both of those incorporated into any kind of inferential framework that we can build in a way that is transparent and really easy to see, in a way that is reproducible so that it can be done consistently across different investigations. We've also got the tension between explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge. So the explicit knowledge, we can have standard operating procedures, we can have well understood and well articulated approaches for certain things at certain parts of that process. We've also got to build in the tacit knowledge, the things that we develop over time, through experience, through practice. How do we bring those two together? Because they're both really, really important. So how can we deal with that? It's important that we have both a knowledge base and an evidence base. And I don't think there would be very much I don't think that there would be too much disagreement about the fact that within the parent disciplines that are applied to forensic science, we've got a fantastic knowledge base. It's been well documented, there is a huge amount of literature, techniques are validated very, very extensively, and it is very clear where the validity of a lot of these processes and approaches lie within the literature, within practice. What we need to work on is the evidence base that we can utilise to enable the application of those well understood and well validated knowledge bases into forensic application. And I would argue that there are two ways that we need to do that. We need to derive data that pertains to evidence dynamics. So how does evidence transfer? How does it persist? How does it get preserved in different scenarios, so that we can make really strong and robust and transparent inferences of the significance of that significance of that evidence. And we also need data to be produced that pertains to the effective human interpretation of data. So the interaction of cognitive processes, of cognitive biases, along with how expertise can be incorporated into that and experience. So, critical to our ability to do that is, as I said, understanding trace evidence dynamics. So it's not just about attributing source, it's about attributing activities that have led to the deposition or transfer of that evidence. And we need to understand how, as decision makers, we are being involved in that interpretation of evidence. What are the other factors that are involved in effectively interpreting evidence that can incorporate the specific contexts that are involved? That's all very well. We don't want it to be a medical sterile environment. We do need it to be casework informed. We need to be working with those who have experience and expertise in the practice of these analyses, to ensure that any kind of data that's produced is based on fundamentally casework informed premises. It does need to be empirical, because that's how we can measure it. And we also need to be building into that process right from the beginning how the results of that research are actually going to be implementable in the field. So there's no point doing some fantastic research that produces a great result if it's not actually implementable, if it's all in R, or it hasn't got a nice user interface, for example. So that's the underpinning. And then if we think about that final part of the process, how do we draw all this together? How do we ensure that not only is the singular form of trace evidence robustly and appropriately interacted with and understood and interpreted, how do we bring that all together in a holistic crime reconstruction that takes into account the entire process, that is sufficiently generalizable so that it is applicable in a wide range of scenarios, but it is context sensitive. It can deal with the particular idiosyncratic variables that are going to be pertinent to a particular case, because obviously every case is going to be different. There are going to be different variables involved. And I think this is one of the areas that particularly the work with Nadine is showing us that there is huge potential. There is huge potential to be able to map these out, to actually provide greater and more insight into what trace evidence can tell us and how it can contribute to forensic reconstruction. Okay, so that's how I think, if we can conceptualize trace evidence, that's going to help us have further conversations about how we can bring inferential approaches to interpreting forensic trace evidence better. What might that look like in reality? What are some of the problems and the questions that we've got as those who work with trace evidence that have the potential to be engaged with and, dare I say it, solved by other approaches? So of all the different forms of trace, these are examples are going to be coming from soil and sediment work that we've been doing that has been instrumental in some of the ideas coming out of this this work. So forensic geoscience, looking at environmental evidence. How can soils and sediments that get on vehicles, that get on footwear, how can they be utilised in forensic reconstruction, both in terms of source attribution but also in terms of reconstructing activities that have led up to and after a crime has occurred. And we look at lots of different aspects of the soils and sediments. There's one particular technique I look at is looking at the quartz grains, the minerals within the sample, which can be very indicative of environment. There are obviously lots of other components within soils, the inorganic signatures, the organic signatures in terms of elemental profiles, but also biological components within the soil. And I know we're going to hear from Pat later, who's the expert in pollen analysis. But it's harnessing all the different components within soil evidence to be able to build a picture. So if we think about what's going on in forensic geoscience that's causing issues that maybe could be very worthwhile to be discussed. So we've got issues of interpretation. That's across the board with all forms of trace evidence, whether that be trace DNA or trace soil and sediment or trace particulates in general. We've got the interaction with different types of evidence, as we've said. How does the dependency or interdependency between different types of trace evidence within a reconstruction aid us or hinder us in terms of developing reproducible methods of interpreting what it means? We've got human decision making at every single part of that process, as I've said, and that needs to be factored in terms of the role that context can have and what the role expertise and experience can have. And then we've got the issue of trace evidence dynamics. Some of the work that we're doing is really opening our eyes to see quite how transferable different forms of trace are. We started looking at it specifically with particulate evidence. It's been expanded to trace DNA. But the transferability of a trace is incredibly important in terms of trying to indicate what it means when we find it in a particular place at a particular time. Okay. Within forensic geoscience, we've got the added complications of, because the fact that we don't have a population database, we don't always know how rare individual components are within a soil and sediment. So expressing uncertainty without that population database is a big issue. One of the ways that we get around it is by trying to always approach things in terms of looking for dissimilarity and looking for exclusionary outputs rather than looking for association. The source and activity questions are critical. And then mixed source samples. Now I know that a huge numbers of different types of trace will have issues with mixed source samples, DNA obviously being a big one. The issue in forensic geoscience is that you've often got components that are in common between two different sources of soil or sediment. And when they're mixed, it's very, very difficult to start identifying which components came from source A and which components came from source B. And that's a very big question, because if you think about the times when you're going to get soil and sediment evidence, it's often on shoes, it's often on vehicles, it's on anthropogenic items that are going to be interacting with multiple sources of material like that. So being able to figure out how to sort that out would be a huge, huge step forward, but it's a significant problem. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of flesh on the bones to that, this issue of mixed sampling, this is a case that we worked on. This is the inside footwell mat of a car, and you can see that there's a sort of top of a foot mark made in the sediment. And when we looked at this, we looked at a variety of different ways, but this is one particular form of analysis that we did using the quartz grain analysis, and you can see that the crime scene had type 1 and type 1A, and we had a first pair of shoes that we were given, but crucially they didn't have type 1A. It did have lots of other things. This is where you can see the mixture thing going on. We've got lots of different sources within those pair of shoes. And then when it came to the vehicle, we also had a significant mixture, but what was interesting is that we could still see 1A being present there. So we could establish that the vehicle had been very near the crime scene, but we didn't have any shoes to show it. So finally, an extra pair of shoes were identified. They'd been through the washing machine, which had problems, and obviously that's got issues in terms of preservation. But what was interesting is, yes, there were other forms, other sources, but we also had 1A. So that was an example where we were able to identify where a mixture had occurred from mixed source samples to compare them with single source samples. But it's not always that simple. So this is another experiment that's been done by another one of our PhD students, Kelly Cheshire, which has just been accepted for publication, which is great. 3 different locations, close proximity locations, which were discriminated with elemental analysis very, very clearly. So you can see this is over 4 different time periods, but the 3 different locations were discriminated very, very well, which was great. We then developed mixtures of those samples in 1-to-1 ratios, and you can see here we've got location A, location C, location B, which looks great. But then here you've got a single source A with a mixture AC, very close to C, quite a long way from A, so what's going on here? And here you've got a mixture of AB squarely within B. Again, we need to figure out how we can think about that, how we can draw those things out. So I'm aware I'm on time, so I'm just going to finish with the questions that I see that we really need to be addressing. I think within forensic geoscience we've got a lot of lessons to learn in the specifics, but I think they come out to a broad questions that need to be asked by all forms of trace evidence. So at the microscale, very, very specifically with forensic geoscience, we need to understand the evidence dynamics. We need to know how materials transfer. We need to know how they persist. We need to know when they're preserved and when they're not. Only if we can look at that, if we can quantify that, if we can in some way model that, are we going to be able to infer the significance of when we find a particular particulate on a particular item at a particular time. We need to think about how we can build exclusion into this model. We need to think about how we can bring in provenance. We need to think about mixed sources. And we also need to think about, at the broader level, how source and activity can be brought together, how the frameworks that bring together multiple sources of information can be built that are reproducible, that are transparent, that can actually be valuable to both the investigator in real time but also in a court system in terms of assessing the weight of the evidence. We need to incorporate the human decision making. That's really, really critical and something that hasn't been done to date. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ruth. Again, much that's discussable later, and we're a few minutes late for the lunch break, but has anyone got any very short comment or quick question? Otherwise, we'll defer discussion. Nothing short? All right, well, let's come back to these topics in the discussion session, and thanks again to both the speakers.